everyone. Can you hear me? Are these working? No. They are working. Do I just need to speak louder? Okay, go for the old-fashioned approach, raising my voice. Anyway, welcome to St Anne's, everyone, for the inaugural event of the Neurodiversity in Oxford project, which is funded by the Diversity Fund. My name's Sian Gronley. I'm one of the English tutors here at St Anne's, and I'm autistic. And my colleague Laura and I have wanted for a long time to do something that would draw together the neurodiverse community in Oxford and make us more visible. It's good to be visible, isn't it? So we're really delighted that you are all here this evening. And of course, we're absolutely thrilled to have Joanne Lindberg here to read to us from a couple of her fabulous books and to answer some questions. So welcome, Joanne. In a moment, I'm going to pass over to Laura, who is going to say a bit more about our project and the events that are coming up. Before that, I've just got a few practical things to run through. This is a relaxed event, so if you need to get up, move around, go out of the room, stim or tick, please go ahead. There will be a movement break about halfway through the event to give everyone who needs it a chance to stretch their legs. So that will be around sort of 5:40-ish. And there is a quiet room if you need to decompress during or after the event. It's seminar room 3 in 27 Banbury. The problem is that you do need a fob to get in, so you will have to come and get me, and I will take you there. But that's not a problem, so do let me know if you need that. I'm just going to be sitting right at the front there. And if you'd like to ask a question, but you don't feel comfortable speaking up in front of everybody, then you can send questions to Facebook or the Twitter feed, and Joel will be able to pick them up and ask them for you. So do feel free to use that as well. And finally, there are drinks after the reading for those of you who would like to stay, and we'd really love it if you could. Laura, over to you.
Am I good with this? Okay. Yes, so hello everyone. I'm Laura. I work on this project with Sian and with Joel and Alvin as well. I'll just tell you a little bit about our project. This is the launch event for our whole project, so thank you so much for being here. The aim of our project is to empower neurodiverse staff and students at Oxford, to celebrate our achievements, and also to connect us, right, and make a kind of sense of community. And we really hope that one of the things that will come from the project is that you guys will get your own ideas of like new projects, new little networks to make. I know that there are already things existing. So we also hope that the project will spark other things. As I mentioned, this is our launch event. So I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening throughout the year. So this is a year-long kind of series of activities that we have programmed. So after this launch, we've got, on November the 24th, we've got a relaxed film screening of the film Keep the Change by Rachel Israel, which has autistic and learning disabled cast, and it's a rom-com. It's really great and funny, so please come to that. In Hillary, we're starting off Hillary with some employment skills training for neurodiverse staff and students. And all of our events are completely free of charge. And these are going to be run by the company The Genius Within, which specialise in helping neurodiverse people to succeed in employment. And we're also in Hillary, we're going to be, again, via The Genius Within, training neurodiverse staff members to be mentors to neurodiverse students. So if you're a staff member and you want to be a mentor, please tell us. I know some people have already told us, but please email us or come up to one of us and tell us so we can add you to our list, which is not as scary as it sounds. And if you are a neurodiverse student who would like to be mentored, please tell us as well, or just be prepared. We're starting with grad students, and then we're hoping to go on to undergrads, aren't we, Sian? In Hillary, we're also having an art exhibition. We really hope you'll come to that. We'll have a little launch for that as well, celebrating kind of neurodiverse art. And then in Trinity, we've got the speaker Avi Mendelsohn, who's an expert on disability in theatre, to come and talk about mental health sensitive theatre. And then we've also got, at the end of Trinity, a performance of Melanade, which is a dyslexia. As the name suggests, it's a kind of delicious show about dyslexia. I should not have tried to say that. So anyway, I hope that all sounds good. So yeah, if please get involved, and we're also looking for people to write on our blog. If you want to air your views on neurodiversity at Oxford, please get in touch with us. We really just, we want people to get involved and like it to be a community, and kind of, we're excited to see what it becomes. Yes. So now I will introduce Joanne Lindberg. We're so happy to have Joanne here. Joanne, your writing on autism and neurodiversity and feminism is just inspiring and beautiful and thought-provoking, historically well-researched. I mean, many adjectives that are good. All the good adjectives. Joanne Lindberg published her first poetry collection, Feminismo, in 2000. And since then, she has published 2 further poetry collections, a collection of poetry for children, 3 non-fiction books, and a novel. Her most recent book, Letters to My Weird Sisters, which is this, on autism and feminism, came out this year from Atlantic Books. She received her PhD in creative writing from Kingston University in 2017, and she is a teaching associate at the University of Cambridge Institute of Continuing Education. Joanne is going to read first from her poetry collection, The Autistic Alice, and then we're going to discuss it a bit. Then we're going to have a break, and then she's going to read from Letters to My Weird Sisters, and we might discuss a bit. And then we're hoping that if people have questions, you will reveal your questions at that point.
Yes, or if you'd rather come up to me afterwards and ask them then, feel free. Okay, I'm going to go up to the reading position now. And you can all still hear me, okay? Yes. So I want to say thank you so much to Laura and to Sian for inviting me. It's such an honour to be at the first event for this group. And I think what a brilliant idea when you were talking there about mentoring. I've often felt that as an autistic adult, as an autistic staff member, people like me are an underused resource. So I think it's fantastic that you're setting up the mentoring. The other thing I'm going to do before I read, and this is for the streaming people, I'm trying to train myself to do this. I'm going to audio describe myself, so in case you didn't already know or can't see, I'm a middle-aged white woman with glasses and no makeup on in a blue dress, so that's me. But what you probably can't see is I'm also autistic, but I didn't know this till I was 42. And the strange thing about being diagnosed in later life is that you have a lot of identity stuff to untangle because you've been spending your whole life thinking you were one thing, but knowing you weren't that thing quite right. But it turns out you're not a rubbish version of that thing. You're a perfectly explicable version of something else. So you then start combing back through your past. And all these memories that were in fragments, good or bad, joy or difficult things, they suddenly join up into a constellation, they make a pattern, and you realize these are your autistic memories of the autistic person that you already were. And being a poet, I wanted to use poetry to do this. And when I was small, as I explained, I started this interest, this intense interest, in the Alice books, Alice in Wonderland, and not Letters to My Weird Sisters, that's my book, Through the Looking Glass. Sorry, a little auditory processing glitch there. And when I was 3, I came across them first, and the first things I saw when I was 3, because I couldn't read at that point, I wasn't particularly precocious in that way, were the pictures, the tennial pictures in the Alice books. And I was very drawn to that girl in the picture she's got a kind of blank face. And I identified with her because I would go through life with that just blank, curious face. And I thought, I can relate to you, whoever you are. And so when I came to try and reconstruct that old autistic self, I thought, well, I would turn to Alice. And also because of that sense of alienation, the sense that I'm reconstructing this other thing, I will go into the third person. And it's a bit of protection going into the third person. It's a bit of protection turning Joanne into Alice. And so in some poems, all I did was go third person Alice. And in others, I used quite a bit from the books. And I'm going to read a few of them. So this one is called Alice's Unbirthday. If you remember, the Mad Hatter and the March Hare talk about unbirthdays. And this was one of those memories I'd not been able to place before. Alice is 3 and she knows it. She's sitting face to face with daffodils underneath the washing line, which is a roundabout for clothes. Her mother pegs some clothing up, gives them all a ride, and pegs again. Alice feels like trying something. "I'm 4, she says. "No, you're not," her mother says. "You're 3. She picks Alice up and pegs her to this rule. It isn't saying it that makes it true. I still remember that moment thinking, okay, so that's the result of that experiment then. She didn't say I was 4. And moving a few years on to when I was about 7, and this is a difficult poem, and I've discovered this poem is more difficult for the parents of autistic people than it is for autistic people themselves, and being a mother myself, a parent, I should say, you don't like to think of your kids having a hard time at school. And it's called Big Alice. And if you remember in the first book, in Alice in Wonderland, she grows and she gets small and it's out of her control. And so I mixed that idea of growing suddenly with a sort of composite of memories from that year. Big Alice. Without meaning to or even knowing, Alice has grown huge again. It starts with her name in an angry voice. "Look what you've done." Since when were her hands so far away? One stuck on her face and covered in ink, the others on the desk by the upended carton with milk seeping out. "Don't just look at it, pick it up." Alice does, but something's wet somewhere. "She's got it all over her skirts." Alice finds her feet and stands on them. The scrape of her chair is thunderous and rude. "Go to the office, get a change of clothes." Eyes watch her thudding damply to the door, the dumbest Alice lump they ever saw. I realise how old I am when I read that poem because I can remember compulsory milk in schools, in primary schools. This next one, Advice for Alice, is a bit of an unusual one because it's in the second person. It's an address to Alice, and it's an address in a way to my younger self, what I wish I could say to myself. And I bring in bits from both books. So there's the chess pieces from Looking Glass, one person being in another person's dream. That's the White King, if you remember, in the Looking Glass. And then the caucus race from the first book where little Alice swims in Big Alice's tears. Advice for Alice. Alice, people are not curiosities for you to stare at. They see you seeing them. They see you back. People are not chess pieces to be moved from square to square. They will not stay where you have put them. They are not lessons to be learned or verse to be recited. They are not information. You can't have them by heart. Alice, they're not just figures in your dreams. They have their own, and you might not be in them. There's no symmetry, no equity, no caucus race. You could swim an age in tears, then run yourself bone dry, and still be left without a prize. Alice, mind you don't confuse your prepositions. You should be in love with, not at. And this next one, Laura was talking to me about autistic joy earlier, and this isn't, a collection entirely about traumas, because not everything about being autistic is traumatic. It's the encounters of the world that doesn't understand you that's traumatic. Being autistic is great. And this is about that, and it's called Alice's Antism. Ground is home to her. It's where her gaze can come to rest. Take stock of what has never changed. The rainbows in the gutter, the points and circles of the pouring rain, the pavement's long squared shoulder. And every summer the ants turn up, shiny black and perfectly themselves, bringing out the ant-shaped joy by which she knows she's Alice still. Funny, I'm not intellectually that interested in ants, but when I see them, little black shiny ants, I'm always pleased. And I realise I'm pleased in the exact same way I was when I was 3, and it's kind of comforting to know something of that core of you is still there. And this next poem is what happens to cover up that core of you. It's called Alice and the Red Queen. If you remember, the Red Queen in Looking Glass is very much the embodiment of the kind of, what's the word? I'm trying to find the word. Capricious, that's right. You know, capricious and authoritarian adults that Alice encounters. Because Alice is, of course, terribly logical, but suddenly from nowhere someone's cross with her, which is quite a common experience for autistic kids. You're just doing something reasonable, and suddenly someone shouts at you for somewhere for no reason. And the Red Queen is the embodiment of that. She's always giving Alice instructions as well. Now, despite what my husband said, this is not a poem about my late mother. It's a poem about all the ways in which older women police younger women. Alice and the Red Queen. Alice takes her first step late. Before she can take a second, the Red Queen grabs her hand. "Stand up straight," she says, "and stop that, whatever it is. Alice, are you listening?" With that, the Red Queen starts yanking Alice in and out of rooms. "Say hello," she shrieks. "Say thank you. Say your name. Don't chew your hair like that." There are others keeping pace, but no one has to yank them. They can run and speak together. "Smile," coos the Queen. "You won't crack your jaw. Why are you so serious?" "Because it is a serious effort, this running to keep pace with all the other ones." "Stop sulking," snaps the Queen. "You need a bra, some heels, and sit with your legs together." Growing up makes running harder, but the Queen is merciless, dragging Alice far from home. "Have some fun," she orders. "Get a boyfriend, have a drink. Dance for me, girl, dance." Dancing is worse than running. Every bit as fast, but now there are steps to remember. And the Queen still shouting, "You're drifting, Alice. Look how far ahead the others are." Alice glances at the Queen and sees she's now as tall as her. "Screw you," she says, and walks.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was absolutely fantastic. I mean, this is maybe quite an obvious question that you don't want to be asked, but why? What was it about Alice in Wonderland that inspired you?
Well, I mentioned sort of some of the things. It was just her face, just somehow I related to the face of the 10-year-old Alice. And also, when I first encountered Alice, it was in a book called The Annotated Alice, which my parents had a copy of, which is what I asked them to get down when I was 3 because I loved the pictures. And The Annotated Alice is just wonderfully autistic book. It's got the original text in the middle, and on both margins, it's got annotations, it's got notes, it's got things about biography, it's got things about maths problems, not that I can understand them, and logic, and bits about Alice growing and shrinking and the growing and shrinking universe. It's great. It's just, you know, the most perfect autistic book you can imagine. But I absolutely loved it. And I've still got that old copy, but it's fallen to bits. And I got my own copy, and that fell to bits. And also there's the fact that Lewis Carroll, I mean, one cannot posthumously diagnose people, but he seems to have been pretty neurodivergent. And one thing I think about Alice is, as the character Alice, as she goes through the world, she's this logical, curious child. And she's just trying to figure things out and be logical and reasonable and civil. And everyone keeps being unreasonable at her. And that's very much how it felt to be an autistic child, sort of going through the school system and encountering various adults. And my mother even said I was like her. She said, you are a bit like Alice, she said. You're always asking questions and you're a bit of a madam.
That annotated Alice sounds brilliant, in endlessly specific details. Great. Yeah, I guess, I mean, you mentioned maths, and I guess one stereotype about us is that we gravitate towards STEM, but I think all autistic people have a creativity to us, don't we? And you've spoken in the past about autism and creativity, and I wondered if you could tell us your thoughts about that.
Yes, well, there's an enormous amount of number of autistic artists and autistic musicians and autistic writers, and more are coming out all the time. And to me, it's not remotely surprising. I mean, when I think about it in terms of poetry, it's arranging words on the page. It's attention to what Sigmund Freud would call language as a thing presentation. So it's the language for the sake of the language, it's the sound of it, it's the words on the page, it's all these things that aren't to do with the sort of semantic pragmatics of it. And I think autistic people often have a very heightened aesthetic sense of one kind or another, and sometimes a synesthesic one. So if you think about somebody like David Byrne, the Talking Heads person, you can hear his interest in the patterns that music makes in the music that he makes. So I think it's about autistic joy, creativity. Yeah, I mean, it's not about, oh, poor things, they're trying to compensate and control one little corner of the world. They can. No, it's fun. It is fun to arrange things in a rainbow pattern. End of.
You heard it first here. Yeah, I completely agree that, autistic joy is definitely real. Yeah. I guess another, we want people to be able to have a little break, don't we? But I guess another thing that I'm really interested to hear from you about is, so you have spoken in the past about and you talk a little bit into My Weird Sisters, don't you, which we're going to hear from later, about making autism legible to neurotypical people, and the extent to which we can do that, and whether we should be trying to do that. And I'm fascinated to hear what your thoughts on that are. Yes, well,
Jim Sinclair, who is one of the early autistic advocates in America, he came up with this brilliant phrase, self-narrating zoo exhibit. And I think that totally sums up what can feel uncomfortable about presenting something like this as an autistic person to a non-autistic audience, particularly if they're professionals and parents who don't themselves identify as autistic. You kind of feel that you're like the Elephant Man almost. You're in a glass case, and you're a dog walking on its hind legs. Isn't it amazing that yet you're so articulate? People seem to think there's some inverse relationship between verbal articulacy and autism, which in my experience of autistic people makes no sense at all. But yeah, so there's that social burden of having to explain yourself. And I started reading after I got my diagnosis, disability studies, and I've read lots about different bits of intersectionality, about the burden of social difference, which I have obviously for some aspects of me and not others. Because obviously if you look at me, I read as the default pretty much, even though I'm not. But I read as it, and that's important. If you remember 5 years ago, just before everything went horrible, sorry, that's politics. Beyonce brought out Lemonade, and I loved that album, and I loved Formation, and I thought, she isn't talking to me. I mean, I'm allowed to listen in, but she isn't talking to me. She's talking to people who share in her own community, in their own language, and I'm privileged to be allowed to listen. And there's a freedom in what she's doing. She's not trying to entertain people. I mean, she can't help but entertain because she's got a fantastic voice. But no, this is her talking her stuff with her people, and it was so much richer and better for that. And I thought, how can I do that? Because when you talk about autism with other autistic people, and most of the support I've got since I was diagnosed was from other autistic people, there's a richness about it and a multidimensional truth that you just don't get when you move into the sort of autism professional area, and suddenly you're talking about triad of impairments. Autism is, what is it?
it's a disorder in social communication. And then it thought, well, maybe from your perspective, but no, it isn't. So I wanted to explicitly say, and I do in the beginning, okay, you can listen in, but this is me talking to my sisters, if you don't mind, or even if you do. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. Yes, thank you so much, Joanne. Joanne, we love to hear you read. We love to be here with you. We're going to have a little break now for 15 minutes so people can move around and do what they want. And then afterwards, we're going to hear some more from Joanne from Letters to My Weird Sister. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much, Joanne. Is that good with everyone? Yay, great.
Thank you, and it's good to see you all back, and we will have some questions, so do think of some. So we talked about the autistic Alice in the first half. In this one, we're going to talk about the recent book, Letters to My Weird Sisters on Autism and Feminism. And I think I started to explain it really when I was talking about Lemonade and wanting to talk to other autistic women. But the first letter in the book is called Letter from Uncanny Valley. And it's the only letter addressed to the actual reader. That's a bit of plastic just went there. Okay. And I'll just read this section. All my life, in all kinds of contexts, I've watched people sense something other about me and react accordingly. Some people back away as soon as they can or push me away. Some people narrow their eyes and try to figure me out. Some read it as vulnerability and become protective. Others read it as vulnerability and become predatory. A few people are drawn to it. One of my infant school teachers ordered me to smile. One of my junior school teachers told me not to look like that. People tell me I look furious when I'm simply trying to concentrate. People start conversations I wasn't expecting and then tell me not to look scared. People have told me I'm too fidgety. Other people have said that I'm so still it freaks them out. Oh, and apparently I have a distinctive walk. My voice is too quiet, but also too loud. And what am I looking at all the way over there? I unsettle people. I'm uncanny. Being around me doesn't always feel like being around a fellow human being, and that discomfort rarely brings out the best in people. If you don't register someone as a fellow human being, you are less inclined to treat them like one. They're a threat, or a nuisance, or an instrument, or an object, or your work, or your responsibility, or an interesting spectacle, but not a person. It's horrible being a non-person. People who know themselves to be people will stand right in front of you and talk about you in the third person as if you weren't even there. You'll try and get their attention and they'll act like no one spoke. It's social death. I'm not claiming that it's a rare experience being dehumanized. You don't have to be uncanny for it to happen. On the contrary, I'm sure most of you will have been on the receiving end of it at some point. As a matter of routine, adults do it to children, men do it to women, bosses do it to subordinates, white people do it to people of colour, abled people do it to disabled people, high-status people do it to the people who serve them and clean up after them, medical staff do it to patients. Anyone who walks past a homeless person on the street and doesn't acknowledge them has done it. If you're a white, middle-class, heterosexual, able-bodied cis male, it won't have happened to you so much. If you're a black, working-class, queer, disabled, trans female, then I'm aware that it will have happened to you a great deal more than it's happened to me. But it has happened to me more than you might expect. And it's happened mostly because I'm uncanny, or weird, or since my very late diagnosis, autistic. At this point, you'll be expecting a definition of autism, and the usual way of meeting this expectation would be to look it up in a diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, say, or from some other official source, an institute, a research centre, the NHS, the National Autistic Society. I'm not going to do that. First of all, you can very easily do it yourselves, and if you're interested enough to pick this book up, you probably already have. Secondly, I wouldn't want to mislead you into thinking that there is any general agreement as to what autism is. There really, really isn't. Thirdly, this is my account written under my name, and I'm not going to describe myself in someone else's terms. That is the very opposite of what I want to do. What I will try to do instead is to convey my own understanding of autism, and as I tend to think in analogies, I will draw one for you now. I'll start by asking you to picture an AA roadmap of Great Britain. If you're under 35, you might want to picture a Google map instead. This roadmap corresponds to the brain and nervous system of a non-autistic or neurotypical individual. There might be a few minor variations between individuals, but broadly speaking, most of the population is working with this sort of map. To make an autistic map, you first need to take out all the A roads. Replace these with a selection of the other roads: motorways, B roads, and the less well-travelled roads, usually referred to as unclassified. Any A road could be replaced with any other kind of road, and the proportions will be different for every individual. You might get mostly B roads and a handful of extra motorways, in which case you will probably strike people as remarkably talented, but at the same time a little off, a little odd. On the other hand, you might lose out on the motorways altogether and end up with a baroque network of narrow, winding unclassifieds, slowing down and complicating your processing to the point where you experience significant difficulties with sensory input, emotional regulation, initiating action, and motor planning. You may be unable to use spoken language at all, may also struggle with basic self-care, and will require a high level of support from others. Most of us will fall somewhere between these two extremes, and no two of us will have the same map. What we have in common is that absence of A roads, the standard ways of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing, which non-autistic people share and can use to understand each other and navigate the worlds they've built for themselves.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I really love that metaphor of the... It's a metaphor, isn't it? Yes, of the rose.
Metaphor, analogy, one or the other.
Yes, the image you used of the rose. I thought that was wonderful and like quite beautifully explained. Something that is quite difficult to explain. I guess, I mean, one of the decisions you make in this book, isn't it, to write to your weird sisters rather than about them. And I wondered if you could tell us why you made that decision.
Yeah, I think, as I was saying earlier, I wanted to get that richness when you're talking to someone who's like you, when you're talking amongst yourself, when you're relaxed and you're being yourself, because otherwise you spend the whole book performing a version of autism and explaining yourself all the time. And I thought, you know what, there are plenty of books that do that. There are plenty of books by autistic people that do that, a lot of very good ones. And nobody needs me to do that, and I don't want to. And I think that realization came through when I'd already started thinking about the book. And I thought, I'm going to write letters to them. And I discovered this through a writer called Georgina Kliege. I think that's how you pronounce it. K-L-E-E-G-E. She's an American academic, an art historian, and she has low vision. She's registered blind. And she wrote this fantastic book called Blind Rage. And it's a sort of memoir and a sort of biography of Helen Keller, but it's letters to Helen Keller. So Helen Keller is throughout you. And she's working out her relationship with this person who was held up as this sort of saintly version of what somebody with a sensory disability should be throughout her life. And she's angry with her, or rather she's angry with the way that she was portrayed, which is actually nothing like the real person, who of course was far more complex and interesting than the, cigarette card picture of Helen Keller. And in doing so, she works through her own identity, she works through her relationship to this other woman and to the community of people who are blind. And I wanted to think about community because it's such a lonely experience growing up autistic. But what I discovered when I went online post-diagnosis was how many people out there, how very generous a community it is, and how very willing and able people are to help each other. And I wanted to celebrate that and to show people that. And also to do what sort of queer historians do, which is you go back and you find your genealogy, you find your people. So it was about finding family, finding community, and celebrating that connection.
Thank you so much. I think that's beautiful. Yeah, I think this feeling that there have always been people like us is very good. I'm very good. It's wonderful to have. My brain stopped working there. Another thing I really liked about your book is that, especially in your letter to Frau V, should I say Frau Val? Frau V, I'm going to say, because I'm... you talk about autistic people as parents, and I know a complaint that is often made in the autistic community is that a lot of resources for autistic people are for autistic children, and they're often for non-autistic parents of autistic children about how to essentially deal with your autistic child. So I love that you write about you write to an autistic woman who was a parent, and I wondered if you could tell us more about that.
Yes, well, sort of discourse around autism and discourse around motherhood are inseparable, really, because one of the things I trace back in the book is back to the awful, awful days of the so-called refrigerator mother, where autism was supposedly the mother's fault. But actually in our society, unconsciously, everything is a mother's fault. You know, all hell and chaos has emerged forth from your fufu. And you know, it's entirely your responsibility. But so I wanted to look at that. I wanted to look at motherhood and the pressures of motherhood, and the particular ways that being an autistic mother makes it harder in some ways, but not necessarily harder in every way, makes it different. And I didn't want to sort of uncouple autism and motherhood, because they are always talked about together, right from the beginning, right from the early papers. The parents are talked about and the mothers are talked about, which is what I talk about in this chapter. And also, I wanted to be clear that you can be both autistic and a mother. In my case, I'm an autistic mother of a non-autistic child, which you would think, from the general discourse, is some kind of impossibility. And actually, there is an enormous overlap between autistic people and parents of autistic people, and why on earth wouldn't there be? It appears, as far as we know, to be genetic, possibly. But I found right at the beginning there was this disconnect, and Frau V is one of the parents of the boys in Asperger's founding paper, the paper from which we eventually get the term Asperger's syndrome. And he gives you a sort of thumbnail portrait of this woman who, he says, and he uses the words, remarkably similar to her son. She's an upper-class Viennese woman. When she gets fed up with her family, she goes and walks in the mountains by herself. She's very intelligent. She's rather dishevelled. She's not great at sort of self-presentation or doing the things that a good Viennese housewife is supposed to do. She's rather rubbish at all that. But she's terribly intelligent and a terribly good historian of her son, and finds all sorts of patterns in her family and behaviour that she talks about. And yet, despite having said this woman was remarkably similar to her son, he pushes that completely aside, and later in the same paper, he makes the connection between, he says, autism is a particular kind of male intelligence, I think. So, you know, SBC gets a lot of stick for that, but he didn't come up with it first. It's been there right in the roots of discourse around autism. So I wanted to say, how come that was mentioned? And in Leo Kanner, the other sort of founder of the autistic diagnosis in America, he also mentions these parents and then pushes it aside. And I thought, I want to bring this mum back. I want to bring this genealogy back. I want to correct this erasure of Frau V, who's sort of buried at the beginning of autistic discourse. And just bring it all together, and also just, to use a good Twitter word, normalise the fact that mothers need help to mother, parents need help to parent. There's not, there's some idea that once you're a service provider or a mother or a parent, that suddenly you don't have any vulnerabilities, any needs. And so there's this weird cognitive dissonance going on, this weird disconnect, and I wanted to sort of try and point to that and try and heal it a bit.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is just anecdotal, but I've heard of a lot of autistic mothers who got their diagnosis because their child was being diagnosed. I found this chapter of your book so rich, and yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you. I just have one more question, which is, I feel that I am the kind of autistic person whose use of language and whose special interest in some ways does align with what mainstream society values. So a lot of autistic academics, for example, we are working on our special interests, and it's kind of aligned with what an institution like the University of Oxford has decided that it values. But one of the issues I negotiate in my own research is how a lot of the people that I research, and they lived many centuries ago, so they cannot speak to me, were people who didn't use language in a way that was valued, who maybe didn't really use language at all in the way that mainstream society thinks of as acceptable language. And I wondered, because you also write letters, for example, to Adelheid Block, and I wondered if you could talk about how you negotiate that, how you, I guess, that kind of privilege, the kind of thinking about hierarchies within autism and things like that. Yeah.
I think it's very important to acknowledge that as an autistic person who can speak to non-autistic people and can pass, that it is a privilege, and that we aren't all of autism. And sometimes some of the resentment that comes from non-autistic identifying autistic parents is they feel that by going out and being clever and interesting, we're somehow erasing their family's experience, but also that the existence of their non-speaking child with high support needs. I don't use the term severe autism, but I don't jump on people for using it because I understand the experience it comes out of. And I wanted to make sure that everyone was in the fold, and also I'd benefited hugely from non-speaking or sometimes non-speaking autistics, such as Amy Sequenzia, Cal Montgomery, Mel Baggs, all of whom I reference. If you haven't seen Mel Baggs' film on, I think, is it In My Own Voice? I think it's called. It's on YouTube. It's an extraordinary founding video from a non-speaking autistic person long before The Reason Why I Jump film came out. And I wanted to acknowledge a commonality with these people. And also, it's just try and, well, I can't correct an injustice. I'm not Wonder Woman. But what we tend to do is, and it's been very clear during COVID, excuse me if I'm rambling a bit, is we talk about the most vulnerable in our society. It's always somebody else. You're never speaking to the most vulnerable in the society, or never speaking as the most vulnerable society. They're a problem that had to be dealt with, but they're not actual people, because of course you would never be like that, which again is an extraordinary cognitive disconnect, because weren't we all once babies, and won't an awful lot of us one day be old and ill and vulnerable? But we don't like to acknowledge this. And I thought, these other autistic people, they're not other autistics, they're like me, they're people, except I can do this one thing, blah, 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 that they can't do, or can't do reliably. And I also wanted to pick up those those bits of myself that had been dragged through clinics. When I was 7 or 8, I went to a speech therapist. I had a stammer, and I was taken to an educational psychologist. And so I had this identity that was partly constructed by clinicians, which is not so very different from someone who spends their life in institutions. It's just that, I also do things that are valued by society and valued, seen as productive. So I, get to be let out into the wild. But yeah, it was very important to me to express solidarity with these other autistic people, not pity, not sympathy, not care even, although care is part of it, but solidarity.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Joanne. It's been really wonderful to hear you read from this book, and it's been wonderful to talk with you about it. We're really keen to hear what questions you guys in the audience might have. We have this roving microphone, which I will attempt to be in charge of. Do you have any questions from Twitter, Joel? No. We did ask for questions, and someone just tweeted, "Please tell Joanne Lindberg that she is amazing." So Joanne Lindberg, you are amazing. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask?
Is this working?
Yes, it
Okay.
is. So I'll stand here if you've got the mic. So
Okay. Hi, Joanne. I'm Ellie. That was really wonderful. So I'd just like to say thank you first. I guess my question was just about, and I know you're not a psychologist, but you are a woman who was diagnosed with autism later in life, and that's true to my own experience. I was only diagnosed 4 months ago.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, so I did like all of secondary school and 2 years
Well,
of uni.
welcome.
Yeah, somehow. yeah, and I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on why it is that as women we get diagnosed so late or misdiagnosed. I don't know about your experience, but I had every other thing under the sun thrown at me
Yeah.
before they were like, no, you're just autistic.
Yeah, I had
so yeah.
Depressed,
Yeah.
anxious, OCD, and those things aren't not true, but they're not the core thing that's going on. And what was it my primary school headmaster said when my mum went with the EdPsych report? She's an average intelligence girl with a personality problem.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Well, I sort of think about it in the book quite a lot, and I think the conclusion I come to, and I'm sure it's only one aspect and not the whole aspect, is that, do you know what applied behaviour analysis is?
No.
No, you wouldn't have come across it yet. It's a very common, I don't know, treatment or schooling or training for autistic people, and it's horrible. It's based on just trying to correct their behaviour so that they can pass and behave more like other people.
I kind of had that in my assessment. I had to do this thing where I looked at pictures of frogs, and they were like,
I've heard of these
yeah.
frogs, yes.
Yeah, and then they were like, what are the frogs doing? And I was like, I don't understand how anyone could describe this normally. I was just like, they're flying. I was like...
Okay, so
Yeah.
someone somewhere thought, what autistic people need are pictures of frogs.
Yeah. It was so
But I was thinking about my upbringing, think about the Red Queen, that poem. I thought girls, especially, being brought up is a kind of casual, informal, applied behavioural analysis. Stop that. Don't sit like that. Don't look like that. Don't talk like that. Smile. Don't dress like that. Put your legs together. You know, if you walk like that, you'll split your skirt. Don't do this. I mean, my mother was very much wanting me to be ladylike. And I think we just get it kind of ground out of us, almost. Well, not ground out. You can't take it out. We have it suppressed more. I mean, I would never say that men don't have their own problems and don't have it, and I'm sure there are ways they have it hard that we don't. But I think there is a certain amount of eccentricity or bruceness or disheveledness or so on that is tolerated in men and seen as part of masculinity, that is seen as inimical to femininity in being women. I think we just get it hammered out of us. Does that sound plausible?
Yeah, I agree.
And if we don't, and if we're not able to have it hammered out of us, we have an exceptionally hard time, I think, because, you know, I can't speak for all women. I know some women do present in a more stereotypical way, and I think they have an extremely hard time.
Yeah.
And also some men present in a less stereotypical way, and they go under the radar too. I once did some kind of panel thing at the Autism Research Centre, because I live in Cambridge, so I went there, and the other autistic person on the panel was a male social worker who'd not been diagnosed till he was 60.
Oh, wow.
And it had only come to light because they changed the organisation at work, so he wasn't doing his own thing anymore, and he couldn't cope.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, how life experiences can make it come to light. Like, for me, it was more coming to uni, I think, pushed me to, like, the limits of what I could cope with. And it probably wasn't until then that I was like, oh, actually, like, I'm not, like, exactly like everyone else in the, like, class. So, yeah, that's so interesting.
Thank you.
Tanya. I'm coming, Tanya, don't worry.
Yeah. Hi, Tanya. Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you so much, Ellie, for sharing your thoughts. And I can relate to like being late diagnosed myself and the kind of the frustrations of it. A question I had was when you mentioned ABA therapy. I'm reluctant to call it therapy. It's obviously a very kind of controversial and divisive issue within the autistic community. And you spoke earlier about sort of the difficulty we can sometimes have in sort of communicating with autistic people who are non-verbal or can't sort of, communicate it. I think the phrase you used in the language is kind of like socially acceptable. So in that respect, there's a lot of kind of discourse online about ABA therapy, and it was horrible in the past, but like parents are coming out and saying ABA therapy has like saved my child, helped my child so much. It's different than it was back in the day, and I've luckily never like had to experience it. So it's kind of, what is the ethical consideration here? What, like, how ethical is it to take their word for it, as opposed to kind of taking only like our word for it. Like, I personally don't agree with the premise. It sounds a lot like gay conversion therapy, which, you know, is problematic in itself. But yeah, where do you draw the balance? Because you want to be understanding of both sides.
It's so
Don't
difficult
you?
because, you know, as being a parent myself, I don't have no empathy for these parents. And I know that, I mean, my child is not autistic, so I'm also aware that I don't know how it feels like to bring up an autistic child. I can't speak to that experience, but I do know how anxious I was, especially after my own experiences, for my son to fit in. And how I would sometimes push him into doing things he didn't really want to do, and it was coming out of my anxiety.
Okay.
Because children are constantly compared to each other. You know, he's 18 now, he's taking a year out. And I said, you know what, this is the first time in his life he's not been assessed and compared against his peers. Because the minute you come out, when you come out of hospital, they give you a little book and you measure how much they're pooing and how much they're taking, milk they're taking in, and how big they are and how weight they are. There's constant comparison to the norm, and it raises a huge amount of anxiety. And of course, you project into the anxiety about children projects into the future. So if you see them be lonely one day at a party, in your head it's like, oh my God, they're going to be alone and miserable their whole lives. So I think it's entirely understandable that parents would want their children to fit in. On the other hand, the testimony of autistic adults who've had it is that they experienced it as abusive. And there's also a consent issue, because a lot of it is about pushing people past their comfort zone and saying, you know, never mind that you find it painful to make eye contact. You've got to do it. Or never mind that you don't want, you know, this person to sit near you. You've got to let them sit near you. So you're telling them to override their own signals. They're telling them when they're uncomfortable and when they're being encroached upon. And while I understand why parents do it, I think in principle that's absolutely wrong. I mean, I'm sure there is a way. I mean, there are social stories, for example. There are ways to explain to children what behaviour is expected of them without training them like they're dogs or horses. You know, with metaphorical, or in one case, I'm afraid, real cattle prods.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think also, when you said the kind of, it pushes them past their comfort zone, it made me think of like exposure therapy for certain phobias and anxieties. And I think like if we force children to undergo ABA, that sort of like medicalizes autism to an extent that's, it doesn't need to be medicalized.
It's like
it's
the
it's not
food
an
things,
illness,
like,
you can't really cure it.
Like there's a difference between having a phobia of a food, say, and just not being able to tolerate the sensory experience of eating it, for example.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay.
Oh, great. Get some good exercise.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, I'm Elif, and I'm not formally diagnosed yet. I'm on a wait list, and, you know, I'm just like sort of exploring what being, you know, perhaps having ASD means to me. So kind of keeping that in mind. And, you know, growing up, I always struggled with sort of finding the sense of community with other women in particular. You know, I always felt like I wasn't like other girls, and as an adult, not like other women. So that's something that I really struggle with. But I always kind of wanted to have that sense of camaraderie with other women, because, like, you know, I know the difficulties that we experience as women in this world, neurotypical or neurodivergent, but like kind of having felt alienated from this community for so long, I wonder what it's like to finally reconnect with maybe other neurodivergent women and finally get that sense of community. And I was kind of wondering what your experience was like, because, you know, your book is obviously letters to, you know, your sisters. And so, like, what is it like to
It's
feel like you belong, you know?
I'll tell you about this unusual experience I had, and you realise how unusual it is. A couple of years ago, I went to the Autistic Art Festival at University of Kent. And at one point I was sitting having coffee with, I think, 4 or 5 other autistic women, most of whom I knew online before. But only, I think I'd only met one of them in person before. But it was such an easy camaraderie. We just sat with each other, and an artist who was there said, still 2 years later, she keeps coming back to that scene in the cafe because it was so extraordinary, and suddenly thought, oh, this is what it feels like to be we, and not them and me. Yeah, because there was no need for translation, and it's only when you experience it that you realise that you don't otherwise. I mean, I have really good friends, of course, who are not autistic, but, you know, I would always feel like I was pretending to be one of the girls. Yeah, but suddenly it's us, and there was one woman now, and she's particularly good at masking, particularly good at fitting in. She's a journalist and a ghostwriter. She can do the social very well. She said, this is the first time I've not wanted to go out and have a break for a cigarette because it's too much. So yeah, when
Maybe
you
she'll
find
save her lungs that way.
yeah,
right
her
people.
lungs would be a lot better, wouldn't they? Yeah, so yeah, it's extraordinary. There's the way I think of it, when I talk to someone else who's autistic, it's as if there's some absence of interference, of noise in the signal that I don't normally realise is there till suddenly it's gone. That's how I would explain it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So happy you came.
Hi. So, just to say, I don't have autism, I have ADHD, but so much of what you were talking about really resonated with me, particularly about what it means to be neurodiverse at Oxford and kind of successfully neurodiverse. And it kind of made me think randomly of this tweet a few years ago by Dominic Cummings, of all people, where he said something along the lines of, we need more weirdos and freaks to join the civil service. And he was essentially talking about neurodiverse people. And it just kind of made me think that the association between intelligence and neurodiversity, that kind of complicated thing, the way that neurodiverse people are sometimes fetishized, like in a way. And I was just wondering if you've had any experience of that kind of being here and like what it means to, you know, be something that people expect in a way, but not expect in terms of like, you know, those features that people take from you as being to their advantage, if that makes sense.
Yeah. People think you're clever and you wind up performing at them because you can't feel like you're with them. And I always used to think that I've got much better at reciprocity as I've got older. But I thought, well, I'm awkward and I get things wrong, but I can bring this sort of intellectual comic performance to the room, and that'll be the value I bring, and that's why I'll have friends. What I found, I went to Cambridge, and what I found was, having been told all my life, as I think a lot of academically able neurodivergent people are, oh, once you get to this university where everyone's as clever as you, you'll fit in so easily. Yeah, I mean, I really relate. And the absolute shock of realising, oh my God, I'm weirded. I think that's an experience possibly peculiar to Oxbridge and some of the other Russell Group universities because of the mythology around them. And I thought, what? So I'm here with all these other people who've done great, but I'm still somehow intellectually intimidating. So I'm intelligent in the wrong way. Yeah. So, I mean, that's how I feel about it. It's like, you know, be like that, but not like that. Yeah, it's a sort of Sheldon Cooper thing.
Yeah.
You know, oh, he's so clever, but he's a nuisance.
Yeah.
And he's a figure of fun. Yeah, but I think there's an awful lot of overlap, I think, between ADHD and autism.
Mm.
I think it's just the different ways we talk about, you know, that's why I use the word weird. It's broader. I just like to reclaim it like queer, we're the weird people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have autism either. I have EEPD. I've only recently been diagnosed as well. And I feel like my whole life I'm looking for somewhere to belong, to be seen, to be understood. And then when you get this diagnosis, it's like you're looking to be understood, but in a different way now by people who are neurotypical. But I was wondering if you had like a breakthrough, because of obviously you've written books directed towards autistic people. Like, what was the breakthrough like when you stopped looking to be understood by neurotypical people and started looking to show you understand autistic people?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yes, I think it was the experience of, because when I was first diagnosed, I thought, oh good, I can drop the performance now. But I hadn't realised that being out in the world, disabled, being autistic is another identity that you're expected to perform. And people are thrown if you don't correspond to what they expect. So, for example, when I was diagnosed, I was just about to start my PhD, which I did in my 40s, and I went to a disabled student allowance assessment because I thought, well, that's what I do. I'm disabled now. I go and get disabled student allowance. That's what I do. And the assessor was totally thrown by me. He said, he was looking at my report from the psychologist, looking at me and saying, oh, I would have expected someone with your profile to have dropped out of your first degree. It's like, well, I'm sorry I didn't. Nobody told me I was supposed to drop out of it. And I also, being in Cambridge and being near the Autism Research Centre, and I was asked to do some things there, and I did. And I found the experience incredibly alienating. And of course, you know, being a sort of academic myself, you're very keen to sort of, in a way, those bits of you that are valued, you're keen to identify with them and to identify with those things that make you a good academic, that give you status, that you can think in the right way. This is how I'll get out of this feeling of being awful. I'll leverage those things that give me status. And I'll be one of them, and I'll talk that language. And I would sit as an autistic person invited to discuss research, and it was so alienating. The language they were using was so alienating, and I thought the way they're generating knowledge here, it's a whole different version of reality that I can't relate to. So at that point I thought, I've got to do something else, because I can't stand it here. So yeah, it was being really put off, and just not wanting to feel like an ant under a microscope. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like, when with the diagnosis period, it's like you're a lab rat and they're trying to fit you into boxes.
Yeah.
And obviously with like diversity, there's like so many spectrums and they all overlap. And a lot of my friends have like ADHD, autism, and all these different disorders. And since we've like kind of grouped together, we've just realised we're so similar in so many different ways that like you wouldn't see on a diagnosis, because it's not the same thing.
No.
And it's like I identify with you in so many ways, but obviously I don't have what you have. And I think when I sat down here, I was really nervous because I was like, I'm not neurodiverse enough to be here. Oh. And then when you started speaking, I just started crying. It was like coming to church. Like, I just felt like I belonged here. And like, it's like the first time to be accepted for like who you are and not seen as like a lab rat or a freak.
Yeah.
It just feels so special and extraordinary.
Thank you. And I hope it's going to become less special and less extraordinary, not for just everyone in this room, but for weird people generally. You know, I hope we can, now that we can be identified and we can find each other.
Thanks so much for your reading your poetry. Can you hear me okay?
I
Is that
can,
better?
yes.
Okay. I'm leaving my mask on. I just wondered if you sort of talk in your book about, trying to describe it,
Intersectionality?
No, no, no.
Not that.
The word has gone from my mind. It starts with inter. But so, like, you know, I have a physical disability. So I had plenty of identities before I got diagnosed with autism. You know, and they were late as well, actually. And maybe because I was autistic, like, you know, I thought, like, growing up as a teenager, pain was normal, dizziness was normal. So it took a long time to unpick that. So, but it was almost like when I had the autism diagnosis, I was like, oh, I don't really want another one. You know what I mean? You know, like I've got plenty of, you know, that sounds silly, but you know, I was obviously looking for more support but you know, it's very hard to unpick my life, if that makes sense, looking back, because I could be standing there having a conversation with you, and my back 20% of my brain would be focused on you because I'm busy dealing with dizziness. But I could also find it hard to unpick the conversation because of the autism and stuff like that. But interestingly enough, I find it much easier to disclose my physical disability, let's say, in the university context. Like, I need this chair, and you know, I have to do short shifts or whatever. But actually, the autism I haven't disclosed because I feel like, oh, I can't tell them something else on top. That's going to be too difficult for them. I'll be in several boxes. So anyway, I just wondered whether that's something you look at in your prose or your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an essay, it's called something like, Am I Disabled, or Do I Describe Myself as Disabled? It's on Eon, and to some extent, you know, I see autism activism as part of disability activism and critical autism studies as part of critical disability studies. But, and I think it's important, again, you know, to group together, because the more of us, the more solidarity, the more effect we can have as a bloc. But there are differences. I think physical disability is different in ways that merely being autistic isn't, but a lot of autistic people, of course, are physically disabled as well. There's a lot of, you know, postural POTS. Yeah, I mean, I've got some hypermobility issues myself, and it's incredibly common. So, you know, pain is common for a lot of autistic people. But autism is somehow seen as a personality trait, I think. I think people struggle to understand, well, it's a disability, or if it's a disability, they don't understand why you would want to say anything positive about it. And it's taking that word disability away from sort of negative connotations without saying, you know, yes, it is difficult. Yes, it is difficult to have inertia. Yes, it is difficult to have speech processing problems like I did just then. Yes, and it's difficult to be in pain. It's difficult to have one's mobility impaired. One can have impairments. But it doesn't mean that globally you have a negative life if you're disabled, that all the non-disabled are over here and all the disabled are over there having a sad, piteous life and being like those collection boxes in the 70s that were little sad children with slots in their heads, if you remember them.
There was this it was quite a while ago, this stand-up comedian. And I can't remember his name. I think his surname was Clark. And I think he's got MS. And he once sat in his wheelchair with the charity box that said "Kill all the puppies," as a kind of, you know, as a performance piece. And loads of people were putting money in because they just saw it was a charity case. You know what I mean? But it was he did some brilliant work like that, some kind of commentary on on the situation.
The other thing is that people can in their minds separate a physical disability from the rest of the person, even though as the person with that body mind, it's not separate from you, actually. It's a big part of your experience, but in their head they can say, well, this is the different thing about that person, I'll put it over there and relate to the rest of her. But with autism, you can't really do that. And I think that's what makes it difficult to disclose, because you almost become immediately a different kind of being in a lot of people's eyes the minute you say that. So, I mean, even now I don't always disclose. I mean, it's quite hard now, I've written all these books now, but I mean, I'm careful about in which situations autism walks into the room before I do. I was rambling a bit. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much. It's 6:30, so we've got to finish our formal question. I'm so sorry, Tanya. But if you want to talk to Joanne more, we're going to have some drinks for half an hour in that part of the lecture theatre. So maybe you can ask Joanne any questions you have after that. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you all for sharing and for your great questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Joanne.